At the beginning of the 15th century, the 100 Years' War was at a halt. The French were preoccupied with the Burgundian-Armagnac conflict, and the English were busy securing stability after a change of regime. But this status quo wouldn't last forever. On April 9th of the year 1413 AD, in Westminster Abbey, Henry V was crowned king after the passing of his father Henry IV. In need of proving himself, the new king saw his opportunity at the other side of the English Channel. Over the last decades, the French had managed to recover most of the land conquered for the English by the Black Prince. Now, however, they were weak. King Charles VI of France seemed to suffer from madness, and the land was torn by the civil war between Burgundians and Armagnacs. The time had come for Henry V to take back what was his by right. The king sent word to 320 captains so as to raise the greatest English host since the Battle of Crécy. Around 8,000 men rallied at Southampton, and in July of 1415, Henry V's fleet departed towards Normandy. Three days later, the English fleet disembarked on the mouth of the River Seine and put the nearby town of Harfleur to siege. The English king aimed to set a foothold on Normandy so he could establish a supply line. However, the defenders of Harfleur proved to be harder to break than Henry expected. 6 weeks went by, and the English camp became riddled with dysentery. Finally, at the end of September, Harfleur bent the knee. King Henry had captured the town, but at the cost of precious time. Campaign season was almost over, and a large French army gathered in the city of Rouen. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, had mustered an impressive force of 12,000 men and threatened to march on Harfleur before long. Despite all of this, the king couldn't just sail back to England. The single capture of Harfleur wouldn't be enough to consolidate Henry's authority back home, or pay the large quantities borrowed for the campaign. So, the king decided to march north along the coast, pillaging his way to the English-held town of Calais. However, this plan wouldn't go as intended either. When the English host met the River Somme, they encountered all forts and crossings either destroyed or heavily guarded by the French. In the south, the Constable of France's army was on the move, heading towards the English force. Henry was forced to march east along the river until a safe crossing was found, with the overwhelming enemy forces at his tail. Finally, after a month of forced march, the pursuing French host under the Constable of France was able to cut off the English army. On October 24th, both forces met in the vicinity of the hamlet of Agincourt and camped for the night. Heavy rain poured over the tents of the weakened and starved English. The camp was in absolute silence, and the king had arranged a strict guard duty to prevent a possible night attack. Henry spent the night hatching a battle plan and strolling along his camp, boosting the morale of his men. In the cold morning of October 25th, 1415 AD, the Battle of Agincourt would take place. The field that separated the opposing forces had recently been ploughed for seeding, and the nighttime downpour had turned the furrowed land into a muddy plain. South of the field, King Henry V of England was the first to arrange his battle order. The English front line was composed of knights and men-at-arms, merely numbering at around 1,000. These had been split into 3 divisions, the left wing being commanded by Baron Thomas de Camoys, the right wing by Duke Edward of York, and the centre under the command of the king himself. The other 5,000 men in Henry's army were longbowmen, who were placed at the flanks and along the battle line. The king had commanded each archer to carry a heavy wooden stake. These sharp spikes were to be driven into the ground and pointed towards the front, so as to impale the charging enemy. The English forces were now ready for battle, with the archers in the flanks protected by stakes and a strong centre. In total, the army of England amounted to 6,000 men, of which 1,000 were heavy infantry and 5,000 were archers. On the other side, the French army took positions in a more relaxed manner. The delay in their deployment was not only due to the lack of haste, but also to the absence of cohesion in their leadership. The French army was commanded by the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, and by the experienced Maréchal Boucicaut jointly. The fact that Charles was low nobility and Boucicaut hadn't even been born a noble meant that their decisions were subject to the deliberation of a council of 3 high-ranking lords. Among them were the Duke of Orléans, Charles of Valois, and the Duke of Burgundy, Jean the Fearless, each of them commanding a force on the battlefield. The fact that the Duke of Orléans and the Duke of Burgundy were on opposite sides of the civil war and hated each other meant that rarely any decision would be unanimous. However it may be, the French formed 2 wide rows of men-at-arms. The foremost division was made up of the most elite knights of the army and was also the most numerous. 2 heavy cavalry forces were put at the flanks, and a final row of light riders was established at the rear. Overall, the French host numbered at around 12,000 men, 8,000 of which were men-at-arms, and 4,000 were crossbowmen and light cavalry. Despite their numerical superiority, the French didn't advance on their enemy. The dense woods at the sides of the plain prevented them from surrounding Henry's forces, thus mitigating their numerical advantage. Besides, the English were low on food and supplies, and their retreat to Calais was cut off by the French host. Henry, before the inaction of his enemy and aware of this, commanded his army to advance. The English longbowmen picked up their stakes and marched forward. King Henry halted the march 200 meters from the French vanguard, and his longbowmen planted their stakes once more. Once the men were ready for battle again, King Henry sent a squad of mounted archers, and he successfully lured the enemy into attacking. Both infantry divisions initiated the march. On the flanks, the cavalry forces darted forward. As soon as they were in range, the English longbowmen released a storm of arrows on the charging riders. The longbowmen, protected by their stakes, released volley after volley, hitting the French cavalry point blank. The arrow volleys cut down many of the knights. Wounded horses trampled over the muddy terrain, throwing their riders and taking flight. Despite the chaos among the French cavalry, a handful of knights managed to reach the English. After a brief fight, the king's forces managed to dispatch the enemy. King Henry had prevailed in the initial cavalry charge, but the bulk of the French army was on the way. As had happened to their mounted counterparts, the French knights were showered with arrows. As the entirety of the French army reached the English line, the furrowed land turned into a slippery bog. Despite the inconvenient ground and the storm of arrows, the French knights pushed fiercely, and the English men-at-arms were hard-pressed. The fighting was so fierce that King Henry himself, as well as the other commanders, fought hand-to-hand in the melee. In the English right flank, the Duke Edward of York took a hit that cracked his skull, killing him in the act. As the battle raged, both sides pushed fiercely to gain control over their enemy, and the fighting turned into a massive brawl. According to the chroniclers, many knights suffocated inside their armor. As time went on, the constant rain of arrows and the muddy terrain finally seemed to take a heavy toll on the French. When the longbowmen ran out of arrows, they unsheathed their sidearms and jumped into the fray. The lack of armor granted them a rare advantage, as they were able to traverse the mud with ease. During the fierce fighting, King Henry took a hit to the head that dented his helmet and chipped away a part of his crown. The Duke of Alençon, in charge of the 2nd Division, was slain when trying to surrender to King Henry. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France and the main commander of the army, was also killed in battle. As their leaders began to fall, French morale severely dropped, and a general rout was triggered. The men-at-arms in the back rows ran towards the camp, while those who didn't have the chance were mercilessly slain. When the battle was over, the number of French prisoners was higher than the English themselves. Additionally, the king had been informed of the presence of a local French lord who had looted the English baggage train. It was clear that the English were not safe yet, or at least they wouldn't be with that number of Frenchmen around. So, before the risk of an uprising by the prisoners, Henry controversially decided to have them killed, sparing only the highest of nobles for ransom. Thus, Henry V had successfully set a foothold at Harfleur, marched deep into French territory, and defeated an army twice the size of his own host, forcing the mighty Kingdom of France to bend the knee. In the following years, he asserted English dominance over the entirety of the Duchy of Normandy, married the daughter of the French king, and was promised to inherit the throne of France. However, his triumph was relatively short-lived as he fell ill and passed away in 1422 AD. The Battle of Agincourt is remembered today as the time a poorly armed English force faced the overwhelming might of the French knights and won.